In a frozen land of ice and snow, high on the Tibetan plateau, an infant river trickles into existence. It courses silently through the barren valleys of a region so high in altitude that it has come to be referred to as the roof of the world. The trickle is joined by others, and still more, as gravity pulls the water relentlessly towards its destiny with the ocean, some 4,900 kilometers away. As the water volume increases, it gains the momentum to break down and then move vast amounts of earth and rock. Over the course of thousands of millennia, this river system has shaped the landscapes that it drains, carving out some of the deepest gorges on Earth, and providing the gift of life through water and silt to regions far and wide. Nature's processes created a bioregion of such intense diversity that in just one river valley, the majority of the Northern Hemisphere's major environment types are accounted for. The range of life they support is almost unrivaled amongst the world's great rivers. Only the Amazon and the Nile basins can compete in terms of biodiversity. In the days when London and Paris were little more than large towns, the world's greatest city, home to over 1 million inhabitants, flourished within its basin. And today, some 50 million people, from dozens of ethnic groupings, depend on the river's bounty for a significant portion of their survival needs. The river is known throughout the world as the Mekong. Its delta regions were thrust into the global spotlight in association with a bitter conflict that raged in the region during the 1960s and 70s. The Second Indochina War, which is often inaccurately referred to as the Vietnam War, involved the direct military participation of 5 of the 6 Mekong nations, as well as the US and its allies. This led to 3 of the Mekong nations emerging as communist states. The publicity surrounding the world's first televised war has shaped international perceptions of the Mekong region more than any other factor. Today, the region lives in relative harmony. For most of the Mekong's people, the river represents life, livelihood, and sustenance, rather than war and violence. The Mekong is the world's most productive inland fishery, with a greater aquatic harvest taken from it annually than the North Sea. The silt the river disperses throughout its floodplain provides some of the richest agricultural soils in Asia. The name Mekong is an English abbreviation of the Thai name for the river, Mae Nam Kong, which means Mother Water Kong. This maternal name perhaps best reflects the reverence reserved for the river by so many of her people. Its vitality is celebrated via diverse festivals, folktales, rituals, rites and traditions throughout the length and breadth of her basin. In an age when the world's greatest mountains have been climbed dozens, if not hundreds of times, the continents traversed, the oceans crossed, it is incredible to think that significant portions of the mighty Mekong River remain unexplored at ground level. Australian author, adventurer, and extreme kayaker Mick O'Shea is launching a daring attempt to make the first ever complete man-powered exploration and navigation of the Mekong's mainstream, from source to sea. A predominantly solo, 4,900-kilometer journey of discovery inspired by a deep fascination with the peoples and environments of the Mekong Valley and a concern for their future. This is his story.
For more than 8 years, it's been my privilege to explore the remote backcountry and waterways of Asia, including more than 20 exploratory whitewater descents on rivers spanning from Tibet to Borneo. But out of all the rivers I've experienced, it's the Mekong that has captured my imagination more than any other. So much of the world's natural and cultural diversity has been crammed into this one river valley that it almost defies explanation. My explorations through the Mekong Basin also helped me learn that the ecology of this incredible river system is on the brink of possibly the most dramatic period of change in its 50 million year evolutionary history. The Mekong River, the central artery of the entire Mekong Basin, which spans almost 800,000 square kilometres, is in the process of effectively being strangled near its midway point by one of the biggest profit-motivated mega-projects in history. The Mekong Cascade of dams consists of a series of at least 8 megadams on the river's mainstream in China, including the world's tallest dam, the Siawan. The scheme is of such immense proportions that its reservoirs will flood some 650 kilometres or 13% of the entire river's length and forever alter the natural flow of water, silt and fisheries between the Mekong nations. With several megadams currently under construction, the natural flow of the Mekong is expected to be fully regulated within the next 10 years, and the full effects of dramatically altering the river's ecology will be felt by millions outside of China. In accordance with international human rights parameters, dam builders are obligated to mitigate the impacts of their projects with the negatively affected peoples, regardless of which part of the river they are from. The right to compensation is particularly important for impoverished subsistence peoples, who often do not possess access to alternative natural resources that can replace those that are compromised by the dams. More than 15 years after construction began, China's dam builders are yet to allocate a single dollar from the immense development budget of over $10 billion towards compensating the losses suffered by the river-dependent peoples downstream of the cascade. To help gauge the scale and range of anticipated effects, I spoke with experts specialising in the Mekong environments of Cambodia, located more than 2,000 kilometres downstream of the dams, where Southeast Asia's largest and most fisheries-productive lake, the Tonle Sap, depends upon the Mekong's natural flow regimen for its vitality.
The Mekong River and the Tonle Sap Great Lake form an absolutely central part of the ecology and therefore the economics of the country. The dependency on fish coming from both those two sources is absolutely massive. The effects of changes in flow of both those, the Tonle Sap and the Mekong, have profound effects on the lives of millions.
Dams in China are devastated. These dams really alter the flow and reduce the high level of the lake. The fish production is directly correlated with the depth of the water. So you have a very high water year, you have a very high level of fish production. As the high water is down, last year it was 1.5 meters lower than normal at the highest point. It just impacts fish production. So much less habitat fish have to occupy.
Before hundreds of kilometres of the Mekong mainstream disappear under a man-made inland sea and the social and environmental impacts we are being warned about take full effect, I intend to lead the first expedition in history to explore and navigate the Mother of Waters from her source in Tibet to the South China Sea, in an attempt to bear witness to the phenomena that is the Mekong, and to gain a deeper understanding of the implications current events will have on the lives of the Mekong's subsistence peoples. As we drove through the regions of Western China towards the Mekong source, I spent a lot of time psychologically preparing myself for the expedition challenges that lay ahead, including blizzards, extreme whitewater, hundreds of kilometres of previously unexplored gorge territory, and a host of unknowns. As I pondered my thoughts, we unexpectedly bumped into a couple of amazing characters who helped me realise that my own adventure was just one of millions of extreme journeys that was taking place within the Mekong Valley that day. All day today I was driving up until we just made it to the Mekong, and the whole time I was thinking about this tough journey that I've got ahead. And then we bumped into these two guys, and they're going from Yushu to Lhasa, and the trip's going to take them about 8 months, so they say. And this guy's prostrating the whole way, every metre of the whole way. So suddenly my trip doesn't seem nearly as difficult as what it did when I woke up this morning. The pilgrims helped me realise how incredibly important the Tibetans' cultural heritage is to them. We drove for more than 70 hours through 3 spectacular provinces that are officially referred to as being located in Western China on the way to the Mekong source. First through northern Yunnan, then along the western edge of Sichuan province, and finally into southern Qinghai. And for almost the entire time, we passed through regions dominated both historically and culturally by the Tibetan peoples. The people looked Tibetan. The architecture was definitely Tibetan. Even the yaks and monasteries looked pretty much Tibetan. Yet not for one moment were we officially in Tibet. We were driving through regions of Tibet that have been locked off from the motherland and fused with Han Chinese-dominated provinces as part of new administration zones. Nearly half of all the Tibetan people have effectively been turned into a minority population in Chinese-dominated provinces as a result of this policy. The Chinese government is actively encouraging millions of Han Chinese from the coastal and central regions of China to migrate to the Tibetan lands, and drab, white-tiled, Han-dominated towns are springing up throughout the traditional regions of Tibet. It became apparent as we travelled that one of the greatest challenges the Tibetan peoples face as we enter the new millennium is maintaining their age-old culture as they are gradually turned into a marginalised minority in their own lands. The Mekong Valley of Tibet is one of the poorest regions in all of Asia. We increasingly encountered subsistence people who live directly off the land, people who walk the precarious tightrope between food surplus and food deficit, as did their forefathers before them. A game where the survival balance is so delicate that a wrong decision or stroke of bad luck on the high plains can easily end in extreme hardship or even disaster for entire communities. Despite China's incredible growth in recent years, it is clear that the people in this region, at least, are not sharing in the spoils. At the settlement of Zado, the last town on the map near the Mekong source, I teamed up with 2 Tibetans, Jimmy, my translator, and Duji, who had guided scientific expeditions to try to locate the Mekong source in the past. Together, we drove to the furthest point the road would take us, a little settlement called Hughes in the Mekong basin of Qinghai, Tibet. Riders were sent out to track down a semi-nomadic herder who was said to know the Mekong source area better than any other man. We were asked to wait. And wait, we did. Finally, I figured that if I used my own techniques of audio torture, the locals might be motivated to speed things along. It worked. dust stirred on the horizon and a mysterious herder and his 10 horses closed in on Hughes. It was Basur. I was assured that if anyone could get us to the Mekong source and back, regardless of the blizzards, it was him. From Hughes, it took us a few long, cold days of riding to reach the source. But we were lucky. The weather was good and we even managed to camp at over 5,000 meters above sea level before setting out for the source. It was precisely as we arrived at the geographical source of the Mekong at an altitude of 5,224 meters that a seemingly unremarkable event helped me notice one of the greatest struggles faced by the Mekong peoples of the Upper Valley. While I was busy celebrating reaching the source in my own typically Western way, my Tibetan friends were busy respecting their ancient cultural heritage. I spoke with Jimmy about his connection with the river and its environment.
In my heart, it's a source of Mekong. It's very important for all the Tibetan, So I pray for everybody have a very kind heart and everybody have a peaceful life in their own life. So I pray for this.
One of the biggest things that separates the Mekong grassroots people from outsiders who make the decisions over their lives and lands is that they have a connection to their natural heritage that is almost beyond the comprehension of outsiders. Over the next few days as we descended the valley, I interviewed a bunch of fascinating characters regarding their spiritual connection to the natural environments around them. And I found that most of them had very similar beliefs to 85-year-old Nagwa.
The river and the mountains are home to powerful spirits. We have to be careful not to upset them. They are washed over by the spirits, so we leave them in peace.
Suddenly, I understood why there was such an abundance of wildlife in the area compared to other parts of China. As we continued down the valley, I began to develop a clearer understanding of the survival balance the Mekong's Tibetan peoples must maintain to subsist in such extreme environments above 4,500 meters in altitude. Their subsistence depends almost entirely on their yak herds. Quite often, the only protection they have against temperatures that dip below minus 30 degrees Celsius are hand-woven yak hair tents warmed by yak dung fires. It was while traveling the Tibetan regions of the Mekong that I managed to draw a direct parallel between the semi-nomadic herders I encountered and millions of subsistence people from the downstream nations. The herders, like so many of the fishermen and farmers who live in the Mekong's tropical regions, survive on a narrow line of subsistence. Any significant decline in the vitality of their survival resources can mean the difference between life and death. The environments and cultures of the valley might change immensely throughout its length, but the stakes in the game of subsistence remain the same throughout. Before long, it was time for my companions to return home. And for a new stage of the journey to begin. Well, I finally made it down to the kayak start point after 10 days by horse up to the source and then back down to a point where there's enough water to start kayaking. I'm at the confluence of the Zaching River and the Zaku River. The Zaku is actually the Mekong later on. From here we estimate it's about 4,760 kilometres to the South China Sea and about 3 million paddle strokes, so I'm pretty keen to get that first one away. As I paddled the first 300 kilometres of its length, the waterway known locally as the Zaku developed from a stream into a lively river. And I began to notice an interesting trend. The Tibetans had almost nothing to do with it on a daily basis. For me, after spending years paddling the lower portions of the river system, this initially seemed pretty unusual, but it didn't take me long to realise exactly why this was the case. The joys of the Mekong descent, paddling in the snow. Not a big fan of paddling in the snow, but the upside is that at least the river's not going to rise too much while it's snowing. It's when the rains come from the monsoon that things are going to change really quick around here, so although it's a bit miserable, I don't mind the snow too much. I faced constant splashes of near-freezing water mixed with brisk winds that often left me struggling just to fight off hypothermia. I had no idea it was possible to get this cold. This sucks. Fortunately, the locals came to my rescue and helped me realise the true worth of yak doo-doo. You're a good man, thank you. Troubles obtaining filming access into the calm portions of the Tibetan Autonomous Region left me languishing in a small Tibetan town for more than 3 weeks. As I watched from my bedroom window, warm winds arrived from the annual monsoon, and they rapidly melted the snow and ice into the Mekong's tributaries. In turn, the snow melt carried vast amounts of dirt, rocks and sediment into the main stream. Within a matter of days, the river changed colour and began rising. Contrary to first impressions, the river is not becoming dirty. In fact, the mineral and organically rich sediment which gives the Mekong its characteristic red tinge throughout most of the year is a vital ingredient in the ecological mix that makes the Mekong Basin the most productive inland fishery on Earth and rejuvenates the floodplain upon which age-old agricultural techniques have evolved. Within weeks, the Mekong had grown into a fully fledged river, and with the permit issues settled, I continued riding its roiling waters towards the sea. Approximately 600 kilometres downstream from the source, the Mekong water volume reaches a critical mass, and it starts cutting through the crust of the Tibetan plateau like a serrated knife. The force of the Mekong has carved out some of the deepest gorges on Earth within the Tibetan regions of China, with depths that at times exceed 3 kilometres and a steep gradient drop that provides some of the most chaotic whitewater I have ever paddled. Prior to my descent through the Tibetan regions, several hundred kilometres of the stretch remained previously unnavigated, and long sections of the more sheer-sided valleys remained completely unexplored, even by the Tibetans. For me, the Mekong Gorges of Tibet represented an exploratory wet dream, and I had the time of my life paddling hundreds of kilometres of rapids and extensive stretches of challenging and fun whitewater. Not every part of it was fun though. So this is one of the worst things about, running canyons and gorges is that, what can happen is that you can get to a point where you can't go forward and it's, almost impossible to go back. So we've spent the last 3 hours here trying to find a way to, walk around this gorge, and it's not really happening. At times, I was forced to make extremely dangerous runs, not because I wanted to, but because the river gave me no choice. and on 2 occasions I was swept for kilometres down violent canyons with nowhere to stop. I was lucky, very lucky, to make it out of the Mekong Gorges alive. The Mekong, like all powerful forces of nature, has a dark side. By the time I had reached the southern portions of the Tibetan realm, I had paddled around 20% of the river's entire length. Yet due to the excessively cold weather and the extreme terrain, the Tibetans' association with the Mekong understandably remained spiritual rather than practical. After more than 2 months of making my way through the Tibetan regions, I experienced a touching display of human kindness from a remarkable woman who actually helped save my life.
I was asleep upstairs and I heard someone knocking at the door. When I opened it, Mick was there. He looked very white, like he was in shock from the cold. He put his hands up like this, and I knew that he needed to be by the fire. He was dripping, wet all over, and his whole body was shivering. I have a son who travels too, and if he's in danger, I want people to help him. So of course, I done everything I could to help him get warm.
So please tell him from the bottom of my heart, thank you very much. I asked Dhamma to accompany us to the river to watch me run the rapid that nearly caused me to drown just a few days earlier. The same hole that beat me up last time, I'm actually going to go straight through the middle of it. When I first invited Amma to watch me run the rapid, I naively thought it would be fun for her. But when I later saw how distraught she was for my safety, I felt deeply touched. Amma's reaction to what she perceived as me being in great danger speaks for itself. Five days earlier, Amma had no idea who I was. My departure from the Tibetan realm was marked by the passing of the spiritual mountain of Kawakorpo, one of the most important pilgrimage sites for the Tibetan people. Kawakorpo is part of the Three Great Rivers UNESCO World Heritage Site, which is arguably the most biologically diverse temperate region on Earth. I spent a couple of days trekking to several sites around the mountain to experience its beauty, which can only be described as phenomenal. And as always, the Tibetan spiritual attachment to their environments was everywhere to be seen. The river progressively got bigger, fueled by the arrival of the monsoon rains, and quite suddenly, almost as swiftly as one can open a car window, the temperature went up by 10 degrees Celsius, and within a day's paddle, the large mountains of the Himalaya were gradually replaced with the oversized terrace hills of central Yunnan. As the topography and the climate changed, so did the cultural dynamic. I had entered the regions traditionally inhabited by the Yi, Bai, Lisu and Dai peoples, who farm rice in terraced fields and live by the traditions of their own unique cultures that have managed, with varying degrees of success, to survive the Cultural Revolution, during which time all of China's people, and particularly the minorities, were severely persecuted if they tried to maintain their cultural identities. For decades, they were forbidden to practice their rich traditions, and their art and architecture were destroyed on a massive scale. While cruising through the regions of central Yunnan, it was a pleasure to notice the people interacting a little with the river for the first time in months. Boats designed to handle the swift currents were occasionally seen on the banks, and the river was not only seen as an obstacle, but also a resource. Yet no sooner had I started to warm to the idea of spending time with the people of China's river cultures, and the river suddenly stopped dead. It was the first dam construction site of the journey, the Siouan, soon to be tallest mega dam structure on Earth. A short distance downstream of Siawan, I encountered the Da Shaoshan, one of two completed dams of the Cascade and one of the smallest. As I looked up at the massive scale of the Da Shaoshan and the enormous body of water it suspended above the valley, I couldn't help but reflect on the research from several geographers who are attempting to point out the immense risks that are being taken by China's mega dam builders. The Asian tsunami of 2004 gave the world a rude awakening into the catastrophic consequences of having vast amounts of water suddenly flush through low-lying population centres. The devastation and suffering unleashed by the tsunami was so widespread and of such immense proportions that it's hard to conceive that man could unintentionally create an even more catastrophic water inundation tragedy. In Western China, where the Mekong Cascade is being constructed, there have been over 100 major earthquakes measuring more than 7 on the Richter scale in the last century alone, making it one of the most seismically volatile regions on Earth. In addition to the seismic instability, China currently has the most prolific dam failure record of any nation on Earth. Official government figures indicate that there have been over 3,200 dam failures within the People's Republic of China. This amounts to approximately 4% of the classified dams in the country. In 1975, a calamitous series of dam and dike bursts in Henan province claimed approximately 230,000 lives and devastated the lives of millions. China's dam builders remain absolutely convinced that their latest megastructures, which have not yet been tested in the field, will be completely invulnerable to the infinitely superior forces of nature. This faith is so absolute that until now, detailed studies of the potential consequences have not been undertaken, and the people downstream of the dams have not been warned of the potentially dangerous decisions that are being made over their lives. With over 30 million people living in the low-lying Mekong floodplain downstream of the dams, some analysts point out that the consequences of this overconfidence and lack of research could be the greatest man-made non-war-related disaster in history. Without detailed scientific analysis, it is not possible to accurately predict how much devastation and loss of life a Mekong Cascade failure might wreak. However, if the far smaller dams of Henan could claim over 200,000 lives, then it does not take much imagination to envision the exponentially larger storage capacity of the Mekong Cascade flushing through the floodplain and claiming the lives of millions. Over the course of the next 12 days, the Mother of Waters gradually surged me from the semi-temperate regions of south-central Yunnan to the subtropical areas near the border with the Southeast Asian nations. It was a peculiar feeling to paddle day after day for hundreds of kilometers and realize that nearly all the people I met would soon be flooded out of their homes, and that most of the dramatic landscapes and natural environments I witnessed would soon disappear under a virtual inland sea. The Mekong gradually transformed from a tumultuous large-volume whitewater river to a waterway of serene natural beauty. As the river mellowed, the first fully developed river cultures started to emerge, and people fished, farmed, and watered their animals down by the mainstream. Of all the Mekong River peoples in China, it seemed the ultimate injustice that those in southern Yunnan, the only ones for whom the river plays a central survival role in their daily way of life, are the people being forced off their lands to make way for hydropower generation. Immediately downstream, from where the southernmost mega dam will stand, I crossed out of China and into the region referred to as the Lower Mekong Basin, which is shared by the nations of Burma, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam. From the time of my arrival, it became clear that I had entered a region dominated by river peoples, whose cultures, traditions, and livelihoods have evolved around the natural cycles of the river and the bounty that it has delivered for millennia. I interviewed dozens of subsistence people who depend on the Mekong as I proceeded, and found that most had absolutely no idea about the mega dams that were under construction a short distance upriver, and that their way of life as fishermen and riverbank farmers are directly under threat from the dams. As the weeks went by, I experienced the wonder of attending intimate, age-old rituals, ceremonies and festivals through which the river peoples celebrate the timeless vitality of the waterway. The natural environments along the river changed constantly, as the types of wildlife and aquatic species they supported changed with them, each surviving within a delicate ecological niche based on the natural cycles of nature. After passing between Thailand and Laos for 4 weeks, I encountered the world's largest volume cascade on the frontier with Cambodia, the Kon Falls. Although only dropping around 8 meters in vertical height, the falls reach an amazing width of some 12 kilometers, and during the rainy season they possess some 8 times more water per second flowing over their rim than the better-known Niagara Falls of North America. Below the Kon Falls, the Mekong crosses into the nation of Cambodia, home to Southeast Asia's largest lake, the Tonle Sap. The Great Lake is one of the most productive communal fisheries on Earth, with over 1 million Cambodian fishermen depending directly upon its bounty for their livelihoods. They currently catch enough fish from the lake to fulfill the needs of some 10 million Cambodians, often trading the fish for rice which is grown on the silt provided by the river. Cambodia is one of the poorest nations on Earth, yet due primarily to the bounty of the lake, each person is able to consume around 40 kilograms of fish per year, making fish by far the most important source of animal protein. If this nutritional source is seriously compromised due to altered water and silt flows into the lower Mekong regions, millions of Cambodians who currently live on or below the poverty line may face serious, even life-threatening food shortages. The southern 500 kilometres of the Mekong's floodplain, including the Tonle Sap, is essentially an immense seasonal wetland habitat which supports over 25 million people in one of the most fisheries and agriculturally productive regions on Earth. The vitality of the region depends heavily on the bounty provided by the Mekong, with water, nutrient-rich silt and fish forming 3 key ingredients that complete the circle of life. I spent months paddling into the lives of the Mekong subsistence peoples to gain just a glimpse into the critical role played by the Mother of Waters. I'm left with no doubt that to truly understand the dimensions of this role would take generations. How does one place a price on traditional ways of life that outsiders will probably never fully understand? On impoverished children sleeping with full stomachs? At what point does the profit-motivated abduction and destruction of vulnerable people's survival resources become a human rights issue worthy of global concern and action? These questions and more haunted me as I paddled the final leg towards the South China Sea. One of the most fundamental of all human rights is the right to basic subsistence resources needed for survival. The fact that millions of Lower Mekong subsistence peoples from 5 nations are not being compensated in any way for the profit-motivated destruction of their survival resources makes the Cascade one of the most widespread international human rights violations of our time. What remains to be seen is whether the international community will attempt to defend their rights by pressing China's dam builders to comply with international standards of mitigation, or whether the Mekong Cascade will simply form an immense international preview of a New World era in which China's perceptions of resource rights and human rights are exported without objection to the vulnerable peoples of the world. With China's dominance of global economic mechanisms only a matter of decades away, some analysts point out that to not take this opportunity to press China's elite to adjust their perceptions will be a decision that will ultimately come back to haunt all of us. "142 days after driving into the regions of Tibet with the goal of challenging the Mekong, Mother of Waters, I experienced the thrill of achieving a hard-won dream and became the first person in history to see her full length from source to sea." And the greatest lesson of the journey hit home. As human beings, there's nothing we can't achieve if we possess the will to make it happen.
US and its allies. This led to 3 of the Mekong nations emerging as communist states. The publicity surrounding the world's first televised war has shaped international perceptions of the Mekong region more than any other factor. Today, the region lives in relative harmony. For most of the Mekong's people, the river represents life, livelihood, and sustenance, rather than war and violence. The Mekong is the world's most productive inland fishery, with a greater aquatic harvest taken from it annually than the North Sea. The silt the river disperses throughout its floodplain provides some of the richest agricultural soils in Asia. The name Mekong is an English abbreviation of the Thai name for the river, Mae Nam Kong, which means Mother Water Kong. This maternal name perhaps best reflects the reverence reserved for the river by so many of her people. Its vitality is celebrated via diverse festivals, folktales, rituals, rites and traditions throughout the length and breadth of her basin. In an age when the world's greatest mountains have been climbed dozens, if not hundreds of times, the continents traversed, the oceans crossed, it is incredible to think that significant portions of the mighty Mekong River remain unexplored at ground level. The range of life they support is almost unrivaled amongst the world's great rivers. Only the Amazon and the Nile basins can compete in terms of biodiversity. In the days when London and Paris were little more than large towns, the world's greatest city, home to over 1 million inhabitants, flourished within its basin. And today, some 50 million people, from dozens of ethnic groupings, depend on the river's bounty for a significant portion of their survival needs. The river is known throughout the world as the Mekong. Its delta regions were thrust into the global spotlight in association with a bitter conflict that raged in the region during the 1960s and 70s. The Second Indochina War, which is often inaccurately referred to as the Vietnam War, involved the direct military participation of 5 of the 6 Mekong nations, as well as the In a frozen land of ice and snow, high on the Tibetan plateau, an infant river trickles into existence. It courses silently through the barren valleys of a region so high in altitude that it has come to be referred to as the roof of the world. The trickle is joined by others, and still more, as gravity pulls the water relentlessly towards its destiny with the ocean, some 4,900 kilometers away. As the water volume increases, it gains the momentum to break down and then move vast amounts of earth and rock. Over the course of thousands of millennia, this river system has shaped the landscapes that it drains, carving out some of the deepest gorges on Earth, and providing the gift of life through water and silt to regions far and wide. Nature's processes created a bioregion of such intense diversity that in just one river valley, the majority of the Northern Hemisphere's major environment types are accounted for. Australian author, adventurer, and extreme kayaker Mick O'Shea is launching a daring attempt to make the first ever complete man-powered exploration and navigation of the Mekong's mainstream, from source to sea. A predominantly solo, 4,900-kilometer journey of discovery, inspired by a deep fascination with the peoples and environments of the Mekong Valley and a concern for their future. This is his story.
For more than 8 years, it's been my privilege to explore the remote backcountry and waterways of Asia, including more than 20 exploratory whitewater descents on rivers spanning from Tibet to Borneo. But out of all the rivers I've experienced, it's the Mekong that has captured my imagination more than any other. So much of the world's natural and cultural diversity has been crammed into this one river valley that it almost defies explanation. My explorations through the Mekong Basin also helped me learn that the ecology of this incredible river system is on the brink of possibly the most dramatic period of change in its 50 million year evolutionary history. The Mekong River, the central artery of the entire Mekong Basin, which spans almost 800,000 square kilometres, is in the process of effectively being strangled near its midway point by one of the biggest profit-motivated mega-projects in history. The Mekong Cascade of dams consists of a series of at least 8 megadams on the river's mainstream in China, including the world's tallest dam, the Siouan. The scheme is of such immense proportions that its reservoirs will flood some 650 kilometres or 13% of the entire river's length and forever alter the natural flow of water, silt and fisheries between the Mekong nations. With several megadams currently under construction, the natural flow of the Mekong is expected to be fully regulated within the next 10 years, and the full effects of dramatically altering the river's ecology will be felt by millions outside of China. In accordance with international human rights parameters, dam builders are obligated to mitigate the impacts of their projects with the negatively affected peoples, regardless of which part of the river they are from. The right to compensation is particularly important for impoverished subsistence peoples, who often do not possess access to alternative